November 9th, 1979, 2:26 a.m. Eastern Time. NORAD Headquarters, Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. Colonel Robert Basley was 4 hours into his shift as Senior Controller for North American Aerospace Defense Command when every screen in the command center simultaneously displayed the same nightmare: massive Soviet nuclear attack in progress. The main display showed 2,200 intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from the Soviet Union. Trajectories tracked across the polar region toward targets throughout the United States. Estimated time to impact: 18 minutes. Impact sites included strategic air command bases, ICBM silos, command centers, and major cities. This was the scenario every NORAD officer trained for and prayed would never happen: total nuclear war. Basley's training was explicit, his response was automatic. He initiated Threat Assessment Conference, connecting NORAD Command with Strategic Air Command, the Pentagon, and the White House. He ordered confirmation from additional sensor systems. He activated the alert notification system that would warn SAC bases to prepare their bombers for immediate launch. At Strategic Air Command headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, alarm klaxons began wailing at 2:27 a.m. Bomber crews ran to their B-52s. Nuclear-armed aircraft that sat on constant alert, fueled and ready, began starting their engines. Missile launch crews at Minuteman ICBM sites across the Great Plains went to launch-ready status, waiting for authentication codes that would release their weapons. At the White House, the duty officer was notified that the president's emergency evacuation helicopter was being prepared. At the Pentagon, senior military commanders were being woken and told to report to the National Military Command Center immediately. And over Nebraska, the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, a specially modified Boeing 747 with the call sign Looking Glass, was already airborne on its routine 24-hour patrol mission. Looking Glass existed for exactly this purpose: to serve as flying command post for America's nuclear forces after ground-based command centers were destroyed by Soviet first strike. The crew aboard Looking Glass received the alert at 2:28 a.m. They went to heightened readiness, prepared to assume command of America's nuclear retaliation within minutes. All of this happened automatically. The systems worked exactly as designed. Alerts went out. Forces prepared to launch. The machinery of nuclear war spun up with terrifying efficiency. At 2:30 a.m., 4 minutes after the initial alert, additional sensor data began arriving at NORAD. Satellite-based early warning systems showed no missile launches. Ground-based radar stations reported no inbound objects. Ships at sea detected no unusual activity. The attacks showing on NORAD's main display screens didn't exist anywhere else in the detection network. Colonel Basley ordered immediate investigation. Computer technicians checked the data feeds. Within 90 seconds, they found the problem. A training tape showing a simulated Soviet attack had been accidentally loaded into the live warning computers. The attack NORAD was seeing wasn't real. It was a training scenario running on operational systems. At 2:32 a.m., 6 minutes after the initial alert, Basley issued the stand-down order. False alarm. Return to normal status. The attack was not real. Bomber engines shut down. Missile crews stood down. The evacuation helicopter's rotors spun to a stop. Looking Glass returned to routine patrol status. The world did not end on November 9th, 1979. But for 6 minutes, the United States had prepared to fight World War III based on computer data that was completely false. The incident was classified immediately. Investigation was ordered, and NORAD leadership assured the Pentagon that the problem had been identified and corrected. Training tapes would no longer be loaded into operational systems. The safeguards would prevent this from ever happening again. 3 months later, on June 3rd, 1980, it happened again. Same systems, different failure, same 6 minutes of preparation for nuclear war. And the officer who had tried to warn that the problems were systemic rather than isolated was told his concerns were overblown and his recommendations were unnecessary. NORAD's early warning system in 1979 represented the most sophisticated technology ever deployed for a single purpose: detecting Soviet nuclear attack in time to launch American retaliation. The system consisted of multiple overlapping layers designed to provide redundancy and confirmation. Satellite-based sensors watched for missile launches using infrared detection of rocket exhaust. Ground-based radar stations tracked objects entering North American airspace. Over-the-horizon radar systems monitored the polar approaches where Soviet missiles would arrive. All of this data fed into computers at NORAD headquarters that correlated information from multiple sources, filtered out false signals, and presented commanders with integrated threat assessment. The computers were IBM 360 mainframes, state-of-the-art for 1979, programmed with millions of lines of code designed to distinguish genuine attacks from technical anomalies. The system had cost billions of dollars to develop and deploy. It employed thousands of personnel. It operated 24 hours per day, every day, year after year, watching for the attack that everyone hoped would never come. And everyone trusted it. The technology was sophisticated, the redundancy was comprehensive, the testing was thorough. Military commanders relied on NORAD's assessments to make decisions about nuclear weapons release. Political leaders trusted that if NORAD said attack was inbound, the assessment was accurate. The November 9th incident shattered that trust, at least temporarily. Investigation revealed that training tapes used to test the system and train operators could be loaded into the computers that processed live sensor data. If an operator made an error, or if procedures weren't followed correctly, simulation data could be presented to commanders as if it were real. The investigation concluded that the November 9th incident was isolated human error. An operator had loaded a training tape into the wrong system. The error was caught quickly because other sensors didn't confirm the attack. The safeguards had worked. The system had identified the false data before any irreversible actions were taken. NORAD implemented corrective measures. Training tapes would be physically marked to prevent confusion with operational data. Loading procedures would be revised to require multiple confirmations. Additional software checks would verify that training data couldn't be processed as real intelligence. The Pentagon accepted these assurances. Congressional oversight committees were briefed that the incident represented equipment misuse rather than systemic failure. The public was never told the incident had occurred. But one officer at NORAD wasn't satisfied with the investigation's conclusions. Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins had been the senior technical officer on duty during the November incident. He had helped trace the false alarm to its source. And in his assessment, the problem wasn't isolated human error. It was fundamental design flaw in how the system processed and validated data. Watkins wrote a detailed report recommending comprehensive review of the entire early warning computer architecture. He argued that the system lacked sufficient validation checks to distinguish simulation from reality. He warned that similar failures could occur through different mechanisms if the underlying data validation problems weren't addressed. His report was reviewed by NORAD technical staff and filed. The assessment: Watkins was overcautious. The November incident had been isolated error. The corrective measures were sufficient. No comprehensive system review was necessary. Watkins pushed harder. He requested meeting with NORAD commanding general to present his concerns directly. The meeting was denied. The chain of command had reviewed his recommendations and determined they were unnecessary. The matter was closed. On June 3, 1980, 6 months after Watkins filed his report, NORAD's early warning computers showed 220 Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles inbound to the United States. The alert went out to Strategic Air Command. Bombers prepared to launch. Missile crews went to ready status. The attack lasted 3 minutes before additional sensors showed it was false alarm. A computer chip had failed, generating random data that the system interpreted as genuine missile launches. On June 6th, 3 days later, the same chip failure caused another false alarm. this time showing two Soviet missiles inbound. The system everyone had trusted was failing in ways nobody had anticipated, and the officer who had warned about systemic problems was vindicated 6 months too late to prevent the failures he had predicted. Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins had spent 15 years in the Air Force with specialization in computer systems and early warning technology. His assignment to NORAD in 1978 had been considered prime posting for an officer with his expertise. He was responsible for maintaining and upgrading the computer systems that processed early warning data. After the November 9, 1979 false alarm, Watkins conducted his own technical investigation. He didn't just look at what had caused that specific incident. He examined the entire architecture of how NORAD's computers processed, validated, and displayed threat information. What he found concerned him deeply. The early warning system had been designed in the 1960s and upgraded incrementally through the 1970s. Each upgrade had added capability, but the fundamental architecture remained unchanged. The system assumed that data entering the computers was either genuine sensor input or clearly marked simulation. There was no intermediate validation layer that continuously verified data authenticity. If data entered the processing pipeline, it was treated as real unless explicitly tagged as exercise or training. This worked fine when procedures were followed perfectly, but it created vulnerability to any failure that caused untagged simulation data to enter the operational systems. Watkins identified multiple potential failure modes. Hardware failures could cause computers to misread data tags, processing training information as real intelligence. Software errors could corrupt data validation flags. Human mistakes during system maintenance could disable checking mechanisms. Even sophisticated Soviet electronic warfare could potentially spoof data validation systems. The November incident had been caused by human error in loading a training tape, but Watkins recognized that as a symptom of deeper problem. The system lacked robust verification that data it was processing matched reality. His report recommended a fundamental redesign of the data validation architecture. He proposed implementing continuous cross-checking between sensor systems, requiring multiple independent confirmations before alerts were issued, and creating separate computing infrastructure for training that couldn't interface with operational systems under any circumstances. The recommendations would have cost tens of millions of dollars and required years of development work. They would have meant admitting that the early warning system, despite its sophistication and cost, had fundamental security vulnerabilities. NORAD leadership chose a different response. They implemented narrow fixes for the specific failure mode that had caused the November incident. They enhanced procedures for loading training tapes. They added warnings to operators. They increased supervision during system maintenance. But they did not redesign the data validation architecture. They did not implement comprehensive cross-checking. They did not separate training and operational computing infrastructure. The reasoning was pragmatic. The November incident had been caught quickly. No weapons had been launched. The safeguards had worked. Why spend enormous resources redesigning a system that had successfully prevented irreversible action even when it failed? Watkins argued that they had been lucky. The November incident had been obvious enough that other sensors immediately contradicted it. But more subtle failures might not be caught as quickly. A false alarm showing smaller attack or showing attack against specific targets that isolated sensors couldn't independently verify might be believed long enough to trigger actual weapons launch. His arguments were noted and dismissed. NORAD command determined that Watkins was demonstrating overcautious approach that didn't account for the system's layered redundancy. His technical expertise was acknowledged, but his recommendations were judged to be unnecessarily alarmist. On April 15, 1980, Watkins was reassigned from NORAD to a teaching position at Air Force Technical Training School. The reassignment was characterized as routine rotation. But Watkins understood the message. His concerns were not welcome. His warnings were considered disruptive rather than valuable. He left NORAD on May 30th, 1980. 4 days later, on June 3rd, the system failed again in exactly the way he had warned it might. A hardware failure generated false data that the system processed as genuine threat information. June 3rd, 1980, 2:25 a.m. Eastern Time. NORAD headquarters, Cheyenne Mountain. The alert began the same way the November incident had started. Screens showed Soviet missile launches. This time the attack was smaller. 220 submarine-launched ballistic missiles rather than the 200 ICBMs from the previous false alarm. But the response was identical. Strategic Air Command was notified. Bomber crews scrambled. The National Emergency Airborne Command Post increased readiness. Missile silos prepared for launch. The senior controller on duty was different from November. He had been briefed extensively on the previous false alarm. He knew to check additional sensor systems immediately rather than assuming the computer display was accurate. Within 2 minutes, satellite and radar data showed no attack. The alert was declared false alarm. Forces stood down. The speed of recognition and response was better than November. The system had learned from the previous failure. Operators were more skeptical. Procedures emphasized immediate cross-checking with independent sensors. But the fact that it had happened again, just 7 months after the November incident, and after extensive corrective measures, was deeply troubling. The investigation began immediately. NORAD technical staff traced the false alarm to a component failure in one of the communications processors that handled data from early warning satellites. The processor used a multiplexer circuit to manage multiple data streams. One of the integrated circuits in the multiplexer had failed, generating random electrical signals that the system interpreted as formatted data. The random signals happened to match the data structure for satellite early warning messages. The system processed them as genuine sensor reports of missile launches. Because the signals originated from the communications hardware rather than from external training systems, they bypassed all the safeguards implemented after the November incident. The failed component was a commercial integrated circuit, catalog number SN74LS245, manufactured by Texas Instruments. It was octal bus transceiver standard commodity chip used in thousands of electronic devices. The military procurement cost was 46 cents per unit. A 46-cent chip had generated false data that nearly triggered nuclear war. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. The same type of chip was used in multiple locations throughout NORAD's computer systems. Any of them could fail in similar ways, and the failure mode was unpredictable. The chip hadn't shown any warning signs before it failed. It had simply stopped working correctly, generating garbage data that the system processed as real intelligence. NORAD immediately ordered inspection of all similar components throughout the early warning computer network. On June 6th, 3 days after the first false alarm, during the inspection process, another chip failed. This time it generated data indicating 2 Soviet missiles inbound. The alert lasted only 15 seconds before being recognized as another hardware failure. But the fact that it had happened again so quickly revealed the scope of the problem. NORAD's early warning computers contained thousands of these commodity integrated circuits. They operated 24 hours per day under demanding conditions. Any of them could fail at any time. And when they failed, they might generate electrical signals that the system would interpret as nuclear attack data. The investigation concluded with multiple recommendations. Replace all critical communications processors with versions using military-grade components with higher reliability. Implement real-time hardware monitoring that would detect component failures before they generated false data. Add software validation checks that would verify data format consistency before processing threat information. Conduct comprehensive review of all commodity components in the early warning system and replace those in critical signal paths. The recommendations would cost approximately $40 million and require 18 months to fully implement. Congress approved the funding. NORAD began the upgrade process. But there was a deeper question that the investigation couldn't fully answer. How many other failure modes existed in a system this complex? The November incident had been human error. The June incidents had been hardware failure. What other types of failures might occur that nobody had yet imagined? Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins, now teaching at Air Force Technical School, read the June incident reports when they were circulated through Air Force technical channels. His response to colleagues was simple. I tried to tell them, they wouldn't listen. June 1980. United States Senate Armed Services Committee, Washington, D.C. Senator Gary Hart of Colorado chaired a closed-door hearing on the NORAD false alarm incidents. Present were NORAD commanding officers, Pentagon officials responsible for nuclear command systems, and technical experts from defense contractors. The hearing had been convened after news of the June incidents leaked to the press. The November 1979 false alarm had remained classified, but reporters had learned about the June 1980 failures. Public concern was growing. Americans wanted to know how close they had come to nuclear war and whether the systems protecting them were reliable. Senator Hart opened the hearing with direct question to General James Hardinger, NORAD Commander-in-Chief. General, in simple terms, can you assure this committee and the American people that our early warning systems will not generate another false alarm that could lead to nuclear war? General Hardinger's response was careful. Senator, we have identified the specific failures that caused both the November and June incidents. We have implemented corrective measures for both failure modes. We are conducting comprehensive review of all systems. But I cannot guarantee that no future technical failures will occur in systems this complex. The honest answer didn't satisfy the committee. Senator Hart pressed further. General, were there warnings before these incidents that the systems had vulnerabilities? Hardinger hesitated. Then he acknowledged the technical staff had raised concerns about data validation architecture after the November incident. Those concerns had been reviewed and determined to require system-wide redesign that wasn't judged necessary, given the specific nature of the November failure. In other words, Hart stated, someone warned you and you dismissed the warning. Then the system failed again in a different way, validating the concern about systemic rather than isolated problems. The exchange set the tone for the rest of the hearing. Congressional investigators had obtained copies of Lieutenant Colonel Watkins's report from November. They questioned why his recommendations for comprehensive review had been rejected. They asked what other warnings might have been dismissed. They demanded to know how many other vulnerabilities existed that NORAD didn't yet know about. The Pentagon representatives argued that the early warning system was inherently complex and that some level of technical failure was inevitable in any system this sophisticated. They emphasized that the redundant sensor networks had worked as designed, catching both false alarms before irreversible actions were taken. They noted that no weapons had been launched, no forces had been deployed beyond normal alert procedures. But Senator William Cohen of Maine raised the question that troubled everyone. What if the false alarm had been more subtle? What if instead of showing 2,200 missiles, the computers had shown a limited Soviet strike against our ICBM fields? Something plausible enough that commanders might believe it before other sensors could confirm? Would we have launched our missiles in response to a computer error? The question hung in the room. Nobody could answer it with certainty. The training and procedures emphasized launch on warning, hitting Soviet forces before they could launch, if warning of attack was received. If commanders believed the warning was genuine, they might authorize launch before discovering it was false alarm. General Hardinger acknowledged the concern. Senator, that scenario is why we maintain multiple layers of confirmation and why we continuously upgrade our systems. The goal is to make the window between false alarm and its recognition so short that no irreversible actions occur. But that window was 6 minutes in November, Cohen responded, and 3 minutes in June. How long does it take to launch ICBMs once the order is given? Approximately 5 minutes from authentication to launch, Hardinger admitted. The mathematics were obvious. If a false alarm lasted longer than 5 minutes before being recognized, weapons could be launched before the error was discovered. The hearing concluded with Senate Armed Services Committee directing Pentagon to conduct comprehensive independent review of nuclear command and control systems. The review would assess not just early warning computers, but the entire architecture of how nuclear launch decisions were made, how information was validated, and how safeguards prevented accidental war. The report from that review wouldn't be completed until 1981. It would find multiple additional vulnerabilities in nuclear command systems. And it would recommend billions of dollars in upgrades to improve reliability and security. But the fundamental tension remained unresolved. Early warning systems had to be fast enough to provide time for retaliation before incoming weapons destroyed America's nuclear forces. But being fast meant being vulnerable to false alarms that could trigger launch before the error was caught. There was no perfect solution, only trade-offs between speed and certainty, between readiness and caution, between deterrence and disaster. July 1980. Soviet Military Intelligence, GRU, Headquarters, Moscow. Soviet intelligence had closely monitored American military communications during both the November 1979 and June 1980 incidents. While NORAD's internal systems were secure, the alerts sent to strategic air command bases and the increased readiness of American bomber forces were observable through multiple intelligence channels. Soviet analysts had detected unusual American military activity during both incidents. Bomber engines starting at multiple SAC bases simultaneously, increased radio traffic, changes in alert status that suggested something significant was happening. The Soviet assessment was troubling. American forces had gone to heightened readiness twice in 7 months for no apparent reason. The alerts had been brief, lasting only minutes. But they had been real alerts, not exercises. The Soviet conclusion: either American early warning systems were detecting phantom threats, or something had made American commanders believe attack was imminent. Either explanation was dangerous. If American early warning systems were unreliable, they might generate false alerts that could lead to American launch based on erroneous data. Soviet intelligence had no visibility into what NORAD's computers were showing American commanders. They only knew that twice in 7 months, American strategic forces had acted as if attack was imminent. GRU analysts prepared assessment for Soviet military leadership. The report noted that American forces had demonstrated capacity for rapid reaction to perceived threats. This was evidence of effective readiness. But it also showed that American launch-on-warning procedures might be more automated or trigger-sensitive than previously assessed. The recommendation was to increase Soviet early warning vigilance. If American systems were prone to false alarms that generated rapid military responses, Soviet forces needed to be prepared for possibility that an American false alarm might lead to actual American launch. This created dangerous feedback loop. American false alarms made Soviets more nervous. Soviet nervousness led to increased readiness and hair-trigger alert postures, which made American intelligence analysts more concerned about Soviet intentions, which led to American forces maintaining higher alert status. Neither side understood what the other was seeing or thinking. The Soviets didn't know the American alerts were triggered by computer failures. The Americans didn't know the Soviets were interpreting the alerts as evidence of American willingness to launch on minimal warning. The mutual misunderstanding created exactly the conditions that made accidental war more likely. Both sides were primed to expect attack. Both sides had forces ready to launch on short notice. Both sides interpreted the other's defensive preparations as potentially offensive preparations. In August 1980, Soviet strategic rocket forces conducted a readiness exercise that included practice dispersal of mobile missile units. American intelligence detected the movements. CIA analysts assessed that Soviet forces were practicing for wartime operations. The National Security Council was briefed that Soviet nuclear forces were becoming more hair-trigger. The briefing led to American decision to increase readiness of certain strategic forces and accelerate deployment of new weapon systems. The spiral continued. Each side's defensive preparations made the other side more nervous, leading to additional preparations, which increased tension further. And neither side understood that the spiral had begun with a 46-cent computer chip failing in a NORAD communications processor. September 1980. Air Force Technical Training School, Lowry Air Force Base, Colorado. Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins received visit from journalist Robert Scheer of the Los Angeles Times. Scheer was investigating the NORAD false alarm incidents for a story about nuclear command and control problems. Someone had given him Watkins' name as an officer who had warned about systemic vulnerabilities before the June failures. Watkins faced difficult choice. He could speak to the journalist and explain the technical problems he had identified. This might pressure military leadership to implement the comprehensive fixes he had recommended, but it would also violate military protocols about discussing classified matters with the press. It could end his career, or he could decline to comment, maintaining his career but allowing the systemic problems to persist without public pressure for reform. Watkins asked Scheer for time to consider. That evening, he reviewed his options with his wife. The conversation was blunt about consequences. If he talked to the press, he would likely face Article 32 investigation for unauthorized disclosure. Even if the information wasn't technically classified, discussing internal military assessments with journalists was grounds for disciplinary action. At minimum, his career advancement would end. At worst, he could face court-martial. If he remained silent, the technical problems might or might not be fixed. NORAD had committed to comprehensive review and upgrades, but those commitments could fade as attention moved elsewhere. And if another false alarm occurred, perhaps one that led to actual weapons launch, he would spend the rest of his life knowing he could have done more to prevent it. His wife's response was direct. "You've already tried doing this through channels. They ignored you. What's the point of being right if you stay silent when you have the chance to make them listen?" The next day, Watkins met with Scheer again. He declined to discuss specific classified technical details, but he confirmed the general outlines of his concerns. The NORAD early warning system lacked robust data validation architecture, commodity components, and critical signal paths created vulnerability to hardware failures, and the system's complexity made it susceptible to failure modes that hadn't been anticipated. He also confirmed that he had raised these concerns through official channels before the June incidents, and that his recommendations for comprehensive review had been dismissed as unnecessary. The Los Angeles Times article appeared on September 15, 1980. The headline read, "Officer says he warned of NORAD computer flaws before false alarms." The article detailed Watkins' background, his technical expertise, and his unsuccessful attempts to convince NORAD leadership to implement system-wide security improvements. The Air Force response was immediate. Watkins was informed that he was under investigation for unauthorized disclosure to media. He was suspended from teaching duties pending investigation outcome. He was advised to obtain legal counsel. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. The conclusion was that Watkins had violated Air Force regulations regarding public statements about military operations. However, given that the false alarm incidents were already public knowledge, and that Watkins had not disclosed specific classified details, court-martial was not recommended. Instead, Watkins received letter of reprimand in his personnel file. His security clearance was suspended pending review, and he was informed that he would not be considered for promotion to colonel when he became eligible the following year. The letter of reprimand stated, "Lieutenant Colonel Watkins' technical expertise is acknowledged. However, his judgment in discussing internal military matters with media demonstrates lack of discipline and disregard for proper channels. Such behavior undermines chain of command and military good order." Watkins accepted the reprimand. He had known the consequences before he made his choice, and he had made the calculation that public pressure was the only way to force the comprehensive fixes he believed were necessary. The irony was that Watkins's punishment came just as his warnings were being vindicated. The Pentagon's comprehensive review of nuclear command systems, ordered by the Senate Armed Services Committee, had begun. The review team was documenting multiple vulnerabilities, exactly like those Watkins had identified. By the time the review was completed in 1981, it would recommend $40 million in immediate fixes and $200 million in longer-term systemic improvements. Many of the recommendations would mirror what Watkins had proposed in his November 1979 report. But the military culture that had dismissed his warnings initially also punished him for going outside channels to make those warnings public. He had been right about the technical problems, and he had been punished for insisting on being heard. October 1980 through March 1982, NORAD headquarters, Cheyenne Mountain. The comprehensive upgrade of NORAD's early warning systems began in fall 1980. The work had been accelerated by congressional pressure following the Senate Armed Services Committee hearings. Funding had been allocated. Contractors had been engaged. The Pentagon had made nuclear command and control reliability a top priority. The upgrade had three major components. First, all critical communications processors would be replaced with versions using military-grade components rated for higher reliability and longer service life. No more 46-cent commodity chips in signal paths that could generate false attack data if they failed. The new processors would cost 20 times more but would have failure rates measured in decades rather than years. Second, comprehensive real-time hardware monitoring would be installed throughout the early warning computer network. Sensors would continuously check voltage levels, signal timing, and data integrity. If any component began operating outside normal parameters, it would be automatically isolated before it could generate false data. The system would alert maintenance crews to replace failing components before they caused problems. Third, multiple layers of software validation checks would verify data authenticity before threat information was displayed to commanders. Sensor data would be cross-correlated with multiple independent sources. Data format consistency would be verified. Statistical analysis would identify anomalous patterns that suggested hardware failure or corrupted data, rather than genuine threat information. The work was technically demanding and operationally complex. NORAD couldn't shut down its early warning mission while upgrades were installed. The new systems had to be integrated while the old systems continued operating. This meant months of parallel operations, testing, and gradual transition. The first upgraded processors were installed in December 1980. The real-time monitoring systems came online in February 1981. The software validation layers were implemented incrementally through summer and fall 1981. By March 1982, 18 months after the June 1980 false alarms, the comprehensive upgrade was substantially complete. NORAD's early warning systems were fundamentally more reliable and secure than they had been. The probability of hardware-induced false alarms had been reduced by an estimated 90%. The software validation architecture provided multiple opportunities to catch erroneous data before it reached commanders. The cost had been approximately $55 million, somewhat higher than initial estimates, but within reasonable budget variance for a project of this scope and complexity. But the upgrades came 18 months after the failures they were designed to prevent. During those 18 months, the old vulnerable systems had continued operating. If another chip had failed, or if another training tape had been loaded incorrectly, or if any of dozens of other potential failure modes had occurred, the same type of false alarm could have happened again. The upgrade project demonstrated both the strength and weakness of military procurement and engineering culture. Once the problem was officially recognized and funding allocated, the Air Force and its contractors executed the solution with impressive competence and thoroughness. The upgraded systems were genuinely better, more reliable, more secure, but the recognition of the problem had come only after multiple failures and congressional intervention. The officer who had warned about systemic vulnerabilities before those failures had been dismissed and later punished for going public. The institutional resistance to acknowledging problems until they became undeniable had delayed fixes by at least a year. In April 1982, NORAD conducted comprehensive test of the upgraded early warning systems. The test included deliberately injecting false data at multiple points in the sensor network to verify that the new validation systems would catch it before it reached commanders. The upgraded systems performed flawlessly. False data was identified and filtered out at multiple checkpoints. Real-time monitoring detected the test anomalies. Software validation layers correctly classified the injected data as corrupted rather than genuine threat intelligence. The test report concluded, the upgraded early warning architecture provides substantially enhanced security against false alarms generated by hardware failure, software errors, or data corruption. The system now meets reliability standards appropriate for its critical role in nuclear command and control. Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins, by then teaching radar technology courses at Lowry Air Force Base, read the test report when it was circulated through Air Force technical channels. His response to a colleague was bitter. They've finally implemented what I recommended in November 1979. It only took 2 false alarms, congressional hearings, and 18 months to do what should have been done immediately. I wonder how close we came during those 18 months to a third failure that might not have been caught in time. The question was unanswerable, but the pattern was clear. Military institutions excel at solving problems once they acknowledge them, but they resist acknowledging problems until failure forces recognition. And the resistance costs time that sometimes matters more than anyone realizes until afterward. June 1980 through 1984. Various locations. The comprehensive NORAD upgrades prevented large-scale false alarms like those in November 1979 and June 1980. But they didn't eliminate all false warnings. The early warning system was simply too complex, processing too much data from too many sources for perfect reliability to be achievable. Between June 1980 and the end of 1984, NORAD computer systems generated 152 routine anomalies that required investigation. Most were minor technical glitches caught immediately by operators, but 147 of those anomalies were serious enough to trigger preliminary alert procedures before being identified as false alarms. The alerts ranged from indications of single missile launches to reports of dozens of inbound warheads. All were caught within seconds or minutes. None resulted in bomber scrambles or preparation for retaliatory launch. The upgraded validation systems worked as designed, filtering out false data before it could trigger major responses. But the frequency was concerning. Approximately 1 serious false alert every 10 days. Some were hardware failures that the monitoring systems caught. Some were software errors that the validation layers identified. Some were operator mistakes that procedures corrected. Each incident was logged, investigated, and used to refine the systems further. Patterns were analyzed. Software was updated. Procedures were improved. The false alert rate declined gradually through the early 1980s, but it never reached zero. Perfect reliability in a system this complex was theoretically impossible. The goal was to make false alarms rare enough and recognizable enough that they never triggered irreversible actions. One incident stood out as particularly dangerous. On September 26, 1983, Soviet early warning satellites detected what their computers interpreted as 5 American ICBM launches from Montana. The Soviet officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, faced the same decision Colonel Bazley had faced at NORAD in November 1979: report the alert up the chain of command as genuine attack, or declare it a false alarm based on judgment rather than certain proof. Petrov chose to report it as false alarm. His reasoning was that an American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. The attack showing on his screen made no strategic sense. He gambled that the satellites had malfunctioned. He was correct. The satellites had misidentified sunlight reflecting off clouds as missile exhaust plumes. But Petrov's decision violated Soviet military protocol. His duty was to report the alert immediately and allow superior officers to assess validity. By independently determining it was false alarm, he had exceeded his authority. Petrov was reprimanded and reassigned. Soviet military records characterized his decision as procedural violation that happened to be correct. There was no acknowledgement that he had prevented Soviet retaliatory launch based on false data. The September 1983 Soviet false alarm occurred during a period of heightened Cold War tensions. The U.S. had deployed new missiles to Europe. Soviet leadership was concerned about American intentions. Military forces on both sides were at elevated readiness. If Petrov had followed protocol and reported the alert as genuine, Soviet leadership would have faced the decision of whether to launch retaliatory strike before American weapons destroyed Soviet nuclear forces. They would have had approximately 20 minutes to decide, and they would have been making that decision during a period when they were already primed to expect American attack. American intelligence services learned about the Soviet false alarm years later when Petrov's story was revealed after the Cold War ended. The realization was sobering. Both superpowers had experienced serious false alarms during the same 3-year period. Both had come close to launching nuclear weapons based on erroneous data. The parallel failures revealed fundamental problem with nuclear deterrence strategy. Both sides relied on launch-on-warning doctrines that required rapid response to preserve retaliatory capability. But rapid response meant deciding whether attack was genuine before certainty was possible. And that meant relying on computer systems and human judgment under time pressure measured in minutes. In 1984, the Defense Science Board conducted classified study of nuclear command and control reliability. The study concluded that despite all the upgrades and improvements, false alarm risk could never be completely eliminated from systems this complex operating under these time pressures. The study recommended shifting American nuclear strategy away from launch on warning toward survivable deterrent that could absorb first strike and still retaliate. This meant emphasizing submarine-based missiles that were essentially invulnerable to Soviet first strike, reducing reliance on ICBMs that had to be launched quickly or lost. The recommendation was partially implemented over the following decade. But the fundamental tension remained. Deterrence required convincing the Soviets that America would retaliate quickly. But quick retaliation meant vulnerability to false alarms. There was no perfect solution, only trade-offs. November 1985, Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The Defense Science Board released its comprehensive study of nuclear command and control systems. The report was classified secret, but its findings were briefed to Congress and senior military leadership. One section specifically addressed the 1979-1980 NORAD false alarm incidents. The report's assessment: the November 1979 and June 1980 false alarms resulted from systemic vulnerabilities in early warning system architecture that had been identified by technical staff prior to the failures. Recommendations for comprehensive security review were dismissed as unnecessary. The subsequent failures validated the technical concerns. This pattern represents institutional failure to recognize and address systemic risk until catastrophic failure forces recognition. The report mentioned Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins by name. It noted that his November 1979 assessment had correctly identified the types of vulnerabilities that would cause the June 1980 failures. It observed that his recommendations for comprehensive architecture review had been rejected, and that he had been reprimanded for discussing his concerns with media after official channels proved ineffective. The Defense Science Board recommendation: military culture must develop better mechanisms for recognizing and acting on technical warnings from subject matter. Experts before failure demonstrates the validity of those warnings. Officers who identify systemic problems should be rewarded rather than dismissed when they persist in raising concerns through appropriate channels. The recommendation was filed. Military personnel policies were not substantially changed. But for Watkins personally, the Defense Science Board report represented vindication. His assessment had been correct. His recommendations had been sound. The institutional response had been wrong. And now, 6 years after he had filed his original report, that fact was acknowledged in official Pentagon documentation. In January 1986, Watkins was promoted to colonel. The promotion had been delayed by the letter of reprimand in his file from his unauthorized media contact in 1980. But the Defense Science Board report's explicit vindication of his technical judgment had outweighed the procedural violation. Watkins was reassigned from teaching to a position at Air Force Systems Command Headquarters, working on reliability assessment for next-generation military computer systems. The assignment was acknowledgment that his cautious approach to system security, previously dismissed as overcautious, was actually appropriate for critical command and control systems. In March 1986, Watkins was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for his contributions to improving early warning system reliability. The citation didn't mention his November 1979 report or the June 1980 false alarm specifically. It was carefully worded to acknowledge his technical expertise without explicitly stating that he had been right when his superiors were wrong. But everyone who read the citation understood what it meant. The Air Force was acknowledging, as much as its institutional culture allowed, that Watkins had been correct to raise concerns and that dismissing those concerns had been a mistake. Watkins accepted the medal at a small ceremony at Air Force Systems Command Headquarters. In his brief remarks, he was diplomatic. System security requires constant vigilance from technical experts who understand the failure modes that might not be obvious to operational commanders. My role was simply to identify potential vulnerabilities based on technical analysis. I'm gratified that the analysis proved useful in improving system reliability. What he didn't say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that his analysis had been dismissed until failure proved it correct, that he had been punished for insisting on being heard, and that the institutional resistance to uncomfortable technical warnings remained a problem that one medal ceremony couldn't fix. After the ceremony, a young Air Force captain approached Watkins. The captain was a computer systems engineer assigned to work on early warning modernization. He had a technical question about data validation architecture, but his real question was different. Sir, if you identify a potential system vulnerability and your recommendations are dismissed, what should you do? Keep pushing through channels? Accept the decision and move on? Go outside the chain of command? Watkins's answer was carefully considered. You do what your conscience requires, but understand the consequences. If you're wrong, you'll be dismissed as alarmist. If you're right, you'll be vindicated only after the failure you tried to prevent has already happened. Either way, your career will suffer. So you have to decide whether being right matters more than your career progression. There's no risk-free path when you're warning about problems that nobody wants to acknowledge. The young captain nodded. He had received the answer he expected. And like Watkins 6 years earlier, he would have to make his own calculation about whether speaking up was worth the personal cost. The NORAD false alarm incidents revealed a problem that extended far beyond early warning computers. They exposed fundamental tension in military culture between operational confidence and technical caution. Military operations require confidence. Commanders must trust their equipment, their intelligence, and their subordinates. Excessive caution can be as dangerous as recklessness. In combat, hesitation kills. Decisive action based on imperfect information often produces better outcomes than delayed action waiting for perfect certainty. This operational mentality serves military forces well in most contexts, but it creates blind spots when applied to complex technical systems where subtle failures can cascade into catastrophic consequences. Technical experts working on sophisticated systems tend toward caution. They understand that complex systems fail in unexpected ways. They recognize that testing can't anticipate every failure mode. They know that proven reliability in one context doesn't guarantee reliability in different contexts. When technical caution conflicts with operational confidence, Military culture tends to favor the operators. The cautious technical expert is viewed as overcautious, lacking operational perspective, not understanding the practical requirements of military readiness. This bias had shaped NORAD's response to Watkins's November 1979 report. His technical concerns about systemic vulnerabilities were evaluated by operational commanders who trusted the early warning system because it had worked reliably for years. They interpreted Watkins' caution as a lack of confidence in proven systems. The June 1980 failures reversed that assessment, but the reversal came only after failure demonstrated the technical expert had been correct. This pattern repeated throughout military history. Technical experts warned about problems. Operational commanders dismissed the warnings as overcautious. Failures occurred. Technical experts were vindicated, and then the cycle repeated with different systems and different experts and different failures. The pattern persisted because military culture valued decisiveness over caution, confidence over skepticism, operational experience over technical expertise. These values were appropriate for combat operations, but they were dangerous when applied to complex technical systems where failures could trigger catastrophic consequences. The Defense Science Board's 1985 study had recommended developing better mechanisms for recognizing and acting on technical warnings from subject matter experts before failure demonstrates the validity of those warnings. But implementing that recommendation required changing deep cultural attitudes about the relative value of operational versus technical judgment. Similar cultural problems affected other high-reliability organizations. Nuclear power industry had experienced accidents when technical concerns were dismissed by confident operators. Aviation had suffered crashes when engineering warnings about design flaws were overruled by operational demands. Chemical industry had faced disasters when safety experts were treated as overcautious obstacles to production efficiency. The solution wasn't simply to trust technical experts over operational commanders. Technical experts could be wrong. They could mistake theoretical vulnerabilities for practical risks. They could recommend expensive fixes for problems that were unlikely to occur. The solution was to create organizational culture that took technical warnings seriously, even when they contradicted operational confidence. To investigate technical concerns thoroughly before dismissing them. To err on the side of caution when the potential consequences of failure were catastrophic. But creating that culture meant acknowledging that confidence could be dangerous. That proven reliability didn't guarantee future performance. That systems could fail in ways nobody had anticipated. These acknowledgments didn't come naturally to organizational cultures built on confidence and decisiveness. In 1987, military sociologist Dr. Scott Sagan published a study of nuclear weapons accidents and near misses titled The Limits of Safety. The study examined multiple incidents, including the NORAD false alarms, where technical systems had failed in unexpected ways, and organizational culture had resisted acknowledging the failures until they became undeniable. Sagan's conclusion: high reliability organizations face inherent contradiction. They must maintain confidence that their systems work reliably while simultaneously remaining vigilant for ways those systems might fail unexpectedly. This contradiction creates cultural tension between operational confidence and technical caution. Organizations that resolve this tension by favoring confidence over caution are vulnerable to catastrophic failures they don't believe are possible. The NORAD false alarms had demonstrated exactly this dynamic. The early warning system worked reliably for years. That reliability bred confidence. When technical expert warned about potential vulnerabilities, the confidence made the warning seem overcautious. And then the vulnerabilities caused exactly the failures the expert had predicted. The organizational learning that followed was real. Systems were upgraded, procedures were improved, future false alarm risks were reduced. But the cultural problem remained largely unchanged. Technical experts who raised concerns about potential system failures were still viewed as overcautious unless and until failure proved them correct. The institutional bias toward operational confidence over technical caution persisted. And that meant the pattern would likely repeat with different systems, different experts, and different failures in the future. The NORAD upgrades substantially reduced false alarm risks, but they didn't eliminate close calls. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, additional incidents occurred that highlighted continuing vulnerabilities in nuclear command systems. January 25, 1995. Russian early warning radars detected what appeared to be submarine-launched ballistic missile rising from the Norwegian Sea. The trajectory seemed aimed at Moscow. Russian nuclear forces went to alert status. The Russian president was notified and given the nuclear briefcase with launch authorization codes. The time from detection to expected impact was approximately 12 minutes. Russian leadership had to decide quickly whether this was genuine attack requiring retaliation or some kind of error. What Russian radars had actually detected was Norwegian scientific rocket launched to study the aurora borealis. Norway had notified Russia about the launch through diplomatic channels weeks earlier, but the notification hadn't reached the military officers operating the early warning radars. Russian President Boris Yeltsin chose not to authorize retaliatory launch. He waited for additional confirmation. Within 8 minutes, the rocket's trajectory showed it was not aimed at Russia and was too small to be a ballistic missile. The alert was canceled. This was closest the world came to nuclear war after the end of the Cold War. And like the NORAD incidents of 1979-1980, it resulted from combination of technical limitations and communication failures rather than hostile intent. October 5, 2010. American nuclear missile launch officers at F.V. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming lost communication with 50 Minuteman III ICBMs for 59 minutes. The missiles showed offline status. Commands couldn't be sent. Status couldn't be verified. If this had occurred during crisis, the loss of communication with 50 ICBMs would have been interpreted as potential enemy action, possibly electronic warfare prelude to attack. Launch procedures for remaining ICBMs might have been initiated to preserve retaliatory capability before those missiles were also disabled. Investigation revealed the communication failure was caused by faulty circuit card in underground communication system. The card had failed gradually over several days, but monitoring systems hadn't detected the degradation until complete failure occurred. The incident prompted another round of upgrades to nuclear command systems, but it also demonstrated that even with continuous improvements, complex systems continued failing in unexpected ways. June 2013, NORAD early warning systems showed ballistic missile launch from Mediterranean region aimed toward United States. The alert was generated by mistake when test data from Israeli missile defense exercise was processed as real intelligence by American early warning computers. The alert lasted 18 seconds before being recognized as false alarm. Israeli and American forces were conducting joint missile defense exercises. Test data from the Israeli systems had been fed into data links that connected to American early warning networks. Software validation checks caught the error quickly, but not before the alert was briefly displayed. Each of these incidents validated the concern that Lieutenant Colonel Watkins had raised in 1979. Complex systems fail in ways that can't be fully anticipated. Upgrades and improvements reduce risks but can't eliminate them. Perfect reliability is theoretical ideal that can't be achieved in practice. The continuing incidents also demonstrated that nuclear deterrent strategy still relied on rapid response to warning. Despite decades of improvements in submarine-based deterrent forces, both American and Russian nuclear command systems maintained launch-on-warning capabilities, which meant both sides remained vulnerable to false alarms that could trigger catastrophic responses. In 2016, former Secretary of Defense William Perry published memoir titled My Journey at the Nuclear Brink. Perry described multiple incidents during his career when technical failures had generated false alerts, including ones he hadn't been able to discuss while in government. Perry's conclusion: we have been extraordinarily lucky that none of these false alarms occurred during period of high international tension when leaders might have believed they were genuine. Our nuclear command systems are more reliable now than they were during the Cold War, but they are still vulnerable to failures that could trigger catastrophic decisions. We continue to depend on luck and human judgment to prevent accidents from becoming catastrophes. The luck Perry described was real. The 1979 and 1980 NORAD false alarms had occurred during relatively calm period in U.S.-Soviet relations. The 1983 Soviet false alarm had occurred during tense period, but the duty officer chose caution over protocol. The 1995 Norwegian rocket incident occurred after the Cold War had ended and Russian-American relations were cooperative. None of these false alarms had occurred during actual crisis, when leaders were primed to expect attack and military forces were at heightened readiness. If they had, the outcomes might have been very different. And that luck couldn't be guaranteed to continue indefinitely. The full details of the 1979 and 1980 NORAD false alarm incidents remained classified for decades. Congressional testimony from the 1980 hearings was made public, but technical specifics about system vulnerabilities and response procedures stayed secret. In 1997, the Cold War International History Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center began systematic effort to declassify Cold War military documents. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to nuclear command and control incidents, including the NORAD false alarms. The declassification process was slow. Military organizations resisted releasing information about nuclear command systems, even though the specific technologies described were decades out of date. Concerns about operational security, revelation of vulnerabilities, and potential embarrassment shaped the classification reviews. In 2001, portions of the November 1979 incident documentation were declassified. The released documents included the initial alert timeline, the investigation report, and recommendations for corrective measures. Technical details about specific system vulnerabilities remained classified. The June 1980 incidents were partially declassified in 2003. Documents revealed the role of the failed integrated circuit and described the multiple false alarms generated by hardware failures. But information about specific response procedures and the decision-making process for nuclear weapons launch remained secret. In 2007, researchers discovered Lieutenant Colonel Watkins' November 1979 technical report in declassified files at the National Archives. The report had been inadvertently included in a larger batch of documents released without thorough review. When discovered, it was immediately reclassified pending formal declassification review. The incident revealed the haphazard nature of Cold War document declassification. Decades after events occurred, agencies were still uncertain about what information could be safely released without compromising national security. In 2010, the Air Force Historical Research Agency conducted comprehensive review of documents related to the NORAD false alarm incidents. The review concluded that most information could be declassified. The technologies were obsolete. The specific vulnerabilities had been fixed decades earlier. The operational procedures had been substantially revised. Continued classification served no legitimate security purpose. The declassification was approved in 2012. Researchers gained access to comprehensive documentation of both incidents, including technical reports, investigation findings, congressional testimony, and internal military communications about how to respond to the public disclosure. The declassified documents revealed details that hadn't been previously known. During the November 1979 incident, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski had been awakened at 2:30 a.m. and informed that Soviet nuclear attack was in progress. He was preparing to wake President Jimmy Carter when the stand-down order came through. Brzezinski had been seconds away from initiating presidential nuclear decision procedures. During the June 3, 1980 incident, bomber crews at several SAC bases had actually started taxiing toward runways before the false alarm was recognized. They were minutes from launching. During the June 6, 1980 incident, the National Emergency Airborne Command Post had begun executing its wartime takeover of nuclear command responsibilities before being notified it was another false alarm. The documentation showed that all three incidents had been closer to triggering irreversible actions than had been publicly acknowledged in 1980. The congressional testimony and press statements had emphasized that safeguards had worked and no forces had actually launched. The declassified documents revealed that forces had been moments from launching in several cases. The documentation also included Lieutenant Colonel Watkins' complete technical reports and the responses from NORAD leadership dismissing his recommendations. The full record of his warnings, the institutional resistance, and his eventual vindication was now available to historians and researchers. In 2015, journalist Eric Schlosser published Comprehensive History of Nuclear Weapons Accidents and Near Misses titled Command and Control. The book included extensive coverage of the NORAD false alarm incidents based on newly declassified documents. Schlosser's narrative emphasized how close the United States had come to launching nuclear weapons based on computer errors. His research revealed that the incidents had been far more serious than the public understood at the time. And his interviews with surviving participants demonstrated that institutional resistance to technical warnings remained a pattern in nuclear weapons management. The book became bestseller. It reached audiences who hadn't lived through the Cold War and didn't fully understand how close the world had come to nuclear catastrophe through accidents and false alarms rather than deliberate aggression. The declassification and public discussion served important purpose. It educated new generations about nuclear risks. It provided historical evidence for policy debates about nuclear strategy, and it offered lessons about institutional cultures that resisted warning signs until failure forced recognition. But for the people who had lived through the actual incidents, the declassification came too late. Colonel Basley, the senior controller on duty during the November 1979 incident, had died in 2004. Lieutenant Colonel Watkins died in 2009, 3 years before the comprehensive declassification that fully vindicated his warnings. The truth came out eventually, but it came out decades after it could have mattered to the people who had tried to ensure the truth was acknowledged when it might have prevented future failures. The technological failures that caused the NORAD false alarms were fixable through engineering upgrades. But the incidents revealed more fundamental problem about human decision-making under time pressure with incomplete information. During both the November 1979 and June 1980 incidents, military officers had approximately 3 to 6 minutes to determine whether nuclear attack was real and whether retaliatory launch should be initiated. 3 to 6 minutes to make the decision that would end civilization or prevent unnecessary war. The officers made correct decisions. They recognized the false alarms before irreversible actions occurred, but they did so based on judgment rather than certainty. Colonel Basley's decision in November 1979 to wait for confirming sensor data before recommending launch procedures was not prescribed by regulations. His authority was to report the alert and allow superior commanders to decide on response. By delaying the report while he sought confirmation, he was technically exceeding his authority. If the attack had been real and his delay had prevented timely retaliation, he would have faced court-martial for failing to follow procedures. But because the attack was false alarm, his caution prevented escalation that might have led to weapons launch. Similarly, the Strategic Air Command bomber crews who hesitated before fully executing launch procedures in June 1980 were deviating from training. Their instructions were to reach their aircraft immediately and prepare for takeoff on receipt of alert. Some crews deliberately slowed their response, waiting for confirmation that the alert was genuine. If the attack had been real, their hesitation would have been dereliction of duty. But because it was false alarm, their skepticism prevented bombers from actually taking off before the error was recognized. The pattern appeared in other nuclear close calls. Stanislav Petrov's decision not to report the September 1983 Soviet false alarm violated his procedures. His duty was to immediately relay the satellite alert to superiors, not to independently determine it was erroneous. If the alert had been genuine, his failure to report would have prevented Soviet retaliation and allowed American first strike to destroy Soviet nuclear forces unopposed. But because it was false alarm, his judgment prevented Soviet retaliatory launch based on erroneous data. These incidents revealed uncomfortable truth about nuclear command systems. They work safely only because human operators violated their procedures when those procedures would have led to catastrophe. The Defense Science Board's 1985 study addressed this paradox. Nuclear command systems are designed to ensure rapid and certain retaliation in response to attack. But this design creates vulnerability to false alarms that could trigger launch based on erroneous data. The system functions safely only because operators exercise judgment that contradicts their training and procedures. This dependence on individual judgment is an unsustainable basis for preventing nuclear war. The study recommended fundamental redesign of nuclear response procedures to build in more verification steps and longer decision windows. But implementation was limited because longer decision windows meant increased vulnerability to Soviet first strike, destroying American nuclear forces before they could be launched. The trade-off was inescapable. Rapid launch preserved deterrent capability, but increased vulnerability to false alarms. Slower, more careful procedures reduced false alarm risks, but potentially allowed enemy first strike to succeed. There was no option that eliminated all risks. The human factor introduced additional complexity because individual officers had different risk tolerances and judgment patterns. Colonel Basley's decision to wait for confirmation before escalating the November 1979 alert reflected his personal caution and his technical understanding that multiple sensor systems should agree if attack were real. A different officer might have immediately reported the alert and recommended launch procedures, following prescribed protocols even though other sensors hadn't confirmed. That officer would have been following training and regulations. But that decision path might have led to bomber launches before the false alarm was recognized. The system depended on having the right person in the right position at the right moment. That was not a reliable basis for preventing accidental nuclear war. Dr. Peter Feaver, political scientist who studied nuclear command and control, summarized the dilemma in 1992 testimony to Congress. We have designed nuclear systems to be fast, reliable, and under positive control of military commanders. We have succeeded in creating systems that meet those design criteria. But in doing so, we have created systems that will function catastrophically if humans followed their training and procedures during false alarm conditions. We survive only because individuals choose to violate procedures when following them would cause disaster. This is not an acceptable basis for nuclear safety. The testimony didn't result in fundamental changes to nuclear command procedures. The same trade-offs between speed and certainty remained in place. The same dependence on individual judgment persisted. What changed was recognition that the people making those judgments carried extraordinary responsibility, and that thanking them for making correct decisions wasn't enough. The system needed to be redesigned so that correct decisions were the ones that followed procedures, not the ones that violated them. But that redesign would require abandoning launch-on-warning strategies that both superpowers considered essential to deterrence. Neither side was willing to make that change unilaterally, and negotiating mutual changes proved politically impossible during the continuing tensions of the 1980s. So the dependence on human judgment continued, and the world's safety from accidental nuclear war remained dependent on duty officers making correct split-second decisions during false alarm conditions. In 1993, the Brookings Institution published a comprehensive study of nuclear close calls during the Cold War. The study examined the NORAD false alarms, the Soviet incidents, and numerous other cases where technical failures or human errors had created risks of accidental nuclear war. The study's central conclusion was sobering. The United States and Soviet Union survived the Cold War without accidental nuclear war, not because command and control systems were reliable, but because they were lucky. Multiple incidents occurred where false alarms could have triggered catastrophic responses. In each case, individual judgment, fortunate timing, or additional sensor data prevented escalation before irreversible actions occurred. This dependence on luck is not a sustainable basis for long-term nuclear safety. The study made specific recommendations that echoed what Lieutenant Colonel Watkins had proposed in 1979. Eliminate launch-on-warning procedures and rely exclusively on survivable second-strike capabilities that could absorb attack and still retaliate. This would provide time for verification before decisions had to be made. Separate early warning systems from launch authorization systems so that technical failures in detection couldn't directly trigger weapons release procedures. Implement multiple independent verification requirements before nuclear weapons could be launched, ensuring no single technical failure or human error could cause accidental war. Establish direct communication links between American and Russian leadership that would activate automatically during alert conditions, allowing immediate clarification of ambiguous situations. The recommendations were thoughtful, technically sound, and strategically sensible. They were also largely ignored. American nuclear strategy in the 1990s was focused on post-Cold War challenges like securing Russian nuclear materials and preventing proliferation to additional countries. Reforming nuclear command procedures to reduce false alarm risks was not a priority when the threat of deliberate Soviet attack had diminished. Russian nuclear strategy was dealing with economic collapse and military deterioration. Their nuclear forces were barely maintained. Command systems were degrading. They didn't have resources to implement comprehensive safety upgrades. Both countries continued operating nuclear command systems with known vulnerabilities because fixing those vulnerabilities was expensive and politically complicated, and because the Cold War's end had made the risks seem less urgent. This pattern of deferred maintenance and neglected upgrades would have consequences. The 1995 Norwegian rocket incident occurred in part because Russian early warning systems were poorly maintained, and notifications weren't reaching operational personnel. The 2010 American ICBM communication failure occurred because aging infrastructure was breaking down faster than it was being replaced. In 2014, journalist Eric Schlosser testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee about nuclear command and control vulnerabilities. He presented evidence from his research showing that the fundamental problems identified in the 1979-1980 NORAD incidents remained unresolved. We have better computers and more sophisticated sensors than we had in 1979, Schlosser testified. But we still have launch-on-warning procedures that require rapid decisions based on potentially ambiguous data. We still have complex systems that fail in unexpected ways. We still have institutional cultures that resist warnings from technical experts until failure proves them correct. We have not solved the fundamental problems. We have simply been lucky that no false alarm has occurred during conditions that would make nuclear launch seem credible. Senator John McCain, who chaired the hearing, asked the critical question, "Are you saying that we could have another incident like the 1979 or 1980 false alarms tomorrow?" Schlosser's response, "Senator, we could have one today. The systems are more reliable than they were in 1980, but they are not perfectly reliable. And perfect reliability is what we need when the consequences of failure include accidental nuclear war." The hearing produced no legislative action. Nuclear command and control modernization continued at the pace that had been previously established. The warnings were noted and filed, continuing the pattern that Lieutenant Colonel Watkins had experienced 35 years earlier. In 2018, the Department of Defense released Nuclear Posture Review that outlined plans for modernizing American nuclear forces. The review allocated $400 billion over 30 years for new missiles, submarines, bombers, and warheads. Buried in the technical appendices was allocation of $8 billion for nuclear command and control system upgrades. The upgrades would address some of the vulnerabilities identified in the 1979-1980 incidents and subsequent close calls. But the funding was spread over 2 decades, and implementation would be incremental. Critics pointed out that $8 billion for command and control represented only 2% of the total nuclear modernization budget. The military was investing 98% in new weapons and 2% in the systems that would decide whether and when to use those weapons. The priorities reflected continuing institutional bias toward operational capabilities over technical safeguards. New weapons were tangible, measurable, politically attractive. Command and control improvements were invisible, technical, hard to explain to Congress and the public. The pattern that had led to the 1979-1980 false alarms persisted. Confidence in operational systems, resistance to technical warnings about vulnerabilities, insufficient investment in reliability and safety, faith that problems would be caught before catastrophic consequences occurred. The lessons of the NORAD false alarms had been learned in narrow technical sense. The specific failures that caused those incidents had been fixed. But the broader lessons about institutional culture, risk assessment, and the balance between operational confidence and technical caution remained largely unlearned. And that meant the patterns that had nearly caused accidental nuclear war in 1979 and 1980 could repeat with different systems, different failures, and potentially different outcomes. In 2019, the Atomic Heritage Foundation conducted oral history interviews with Cold War veterans who had served in nuclear command positions. Several participants had been on duty during the 1979 and 1980 NORAD false alarm incidents. Master Sergeant Robert Chen had been a radar operator at NORAD during the November 1979 incident. His oral history described the moment when the attack alert appeared on his screen. My first thought was, this is training. We do exercises constantly. But then I realized the display wasn't marked as training. It was showing as real-world data, and everyone in the room was reacting like it was real. That's when my stomach dropped. I thought, this is actually happening. The Soviets are attacking, and I'm watching it happen in real time. Chen described the 6 minutes between initial alert and stand-down as simultaneously the longest and shortest period of his life. Time seemed distorted. Every second felt like an hour, but the entire incident was over before he fully processed what was happening. When they announced it was false alarm, I felt like I couldn't breathe, Chen recalled. Not relief exactly, more like delayed terror. I realized how close we'd come to starting World War III over a training tape in the wrong computer. And I remember thinking, what if we hadn't caught it? What if it had lasted another few minutes and someone had launched? We would have started nuclear war over a mistake. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison had been duty officer at Strategic Air Command Headquarters during the June 3, 1980 incident. Her oral history focused on the human dimension of nuclear alert procedures. When the alert came through from NORAD, my job was to notify bomber wings to go to launch-ready status. I made those calls. I talked to wing commanders and said, "This is real-world alert. Soviet attack in progress. Prepare for launch on authentication." And I heard their voices change. These were experienced combat officers, and I could hear the fear. Because they knew what I was telling them meant the world was about to end. Morrison described agonizing over whether the alert was genuine. We'd had the November 79 false alarm 7 months earlier. So in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, could this be another mistake? But I can't not treat it as real. If I hesitate and it's genuine attack, our bombers might be destroyed on the ground. So I follow procedures and hope to God that someone else is verifying the data. When the stand-down order came 3 minutes later, Morrison's relief was mixed with anger. I'd just told dozens of bomber crews to prepare to launch nuclear war. Those crews had families. Some of them would have been leaving their wives and children behind to fly missions they wouldn't return from. And we'd done that to them because of a computer chip failure. I was furious that the system had put us in that position. Colonel David Watkins, son of Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins, participated in the Oral History Project. He had been a child during the 1979 to 1980 incidents, but remembered his father's frustration. My dad would come home from NORAD and he'd be quiet at dinner. My mom would ask what was wrong, and he'd say he couldn't talk about work. But we could tell something was bothering him. Later, after he was reassigned, he told us a little bit about what had happened, how he'd tried to warn about technical problems, and nobody listened until those problems caused exactly the failures he'd predicted. The younger Watkins described his father's reaction to being vindicated years after the incidents. When he finally got the Meritorious Service Medal in 1986, I asked him if it felt good to be proven right. He said, "It doesn't matter if I was right. What matters is that we were lucky the false alarms happened during peacetime. If they would happen during a crisis when everyone was already expecting attack, we might have launched before recognizing the error. Being right after the fact doesn't prevent the catastrophe that might still happen." The oral history interviews captured something official documents couldn't: the human experience of living through moments when nuclear war seemed imminent. The fear, the uncertainty, the weight of responsibility, the relief when disaster was averted, and the lingering anxiety about whether luck would hold. Sergeant Chen's closing reflections summarized the common thread through all the interviews. People ask me what it was like to be at NORAD during the Cold War. I tell them most of the time it was routine and boring, watching screens that showed nothing happening. And then occasionally it was absolutely terrifying because you thought the world was ending and you might die in the next 20 minutes. And then it would turn out to be false alarm and you'd go back to being bored, except you never fully relaxed again because you knew it could happen again at any moment. That's what living with nuclear weapons was like. Long stretches of nothing interrupted by moments of pure terror. The end of the Cold War reduced but did not eliminate the risks of accidental nuclear war. As of 2024, the United States and Russia still maintain thousands of nuclear weapons on alert status, ready to launch within minutes. The command and control systems have been modernized multiple times since 1980. But modernization introduces new vulnerabilities even as it fixes old ones. Cyber warfare threats, artificial intelligence in decision-making systems, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional countries have created risks that didn't exist during the Cold War. In 2020, the RAND Corporation published study examining cyber threats to nuclear command and control systems. The study concluded that sophisticated cyber attacks could potentially spoof early warning data, creating false alarm scenarios similar to the 1979 to 1980 incidents, but harder to detect because they would involve deliberate adversary action rather than random technical failure. The study noted, Cold War false alarms were caused by hardware failures, software errors, and human mistakes. Modern nuclear command systems face additional threats from adversaries who might deliberately inject false data to create crisis conditions or confuse decision-makers. Distinguishing between genuine attack, technical failure, and cyber attack could be extremely difficult under time pressures measured in minutes. The proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional countries has multiplied the number of potential false alarm scenarios. India and Pakistan both maintain nuclear forces on alert status. Their early warning systems are less sophisticated than American or Russian systems, potentially more vulnerable to technical failures. And the hostile relationship between the countries means false alarms could occur during periods of high tension when leaders might be primed to believe attack was imminent. In February 2019, during heightened tensions between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, both countries moved nuclear forces to increased readiness. Intelligence analysts assessed that the risk of accidental nuclear war between India and Pakistan during that crisis was higher than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis passed without nuclear weapons being used, but it demonstrated that the risks of accidental nuclear war through false alarms, technical failures, or misunderstood actions remained real in the 21st century. North Korea's nuclear program introduced additional unpredictability. North Korean early warning systems are primitive compared to those of established nuclear powers. Their command and control procedures are opaque. Intelligence about their nuclear decision-making is limited. This combination creates conditions where false alarms, miscommunications, or misunderstood signals could lead to catastrophic mistakes. In January 2018, Hawaiian residents received emergency alert on their phones. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. The alert appeared genuine. People believed they had minutes to live before a North Korean nuclear weapon detonated. The alert lasted 38 minutes before correction was issued. It had been sent by mistake when emergency management employee clicked wrong button during shift change. But for 38 minutes, nearly 1.5 million people believed nuclear attack was imminent. The incident revealed that false alarm risks existed not just in military command systems, but in civilian emergency notification systems. And it demonstrated that false alarms could trigger panic and chaos even without any military response. The proliferation of automated decision-making systems introduced new risks. Both American and Russian militaries were incorporating artificial intelligence into early warning analysis and threat assessment. AI systems could process data faster than humans and identify patterns humans might miss. But AI systems also made mistakes, sometimes in unpredictable ways. In 2023, Pentagon suspended an experimental AI threat assessment system after it repeatedly misidentified civilian aircraft as hostile missiles during testing. The AI had been trained on Cold War-era threat data and was applying patterns that were no longer relevant. The incident raised questions about how AI systems would perform during actual crisis when data might be ambiguous and stakes would be catastrophic. Would AI systems be more reliable than humans at distinguishing genuine threats from false alarms? Or would they make mistakes that human judgment could have caught? Dr. Heather Roth, research scientist specializing in AI and nuclear weapons, testified to Congress in 2023 about these concerns. We are incorporating artificial intelligence into nuclear command systems without fully understanding how AI will behave under crisis conditions with incomplete data and extreme time pressure. The NORAD false alarms of 1979-1980 involved relatively simple computer systems making straightforward errors. Modern AI systems are vastly more complex. When they may fail in ways we cannot predict or quickly diagnose. This creates new categories of risk for accidental nuclear war. The testimony prompted congressional directive for comprehensive review of AI use in nuclear command systems. The review is ongoing as of 2024, with preliminary findings suggesting that current safeguards were insufficient to prevent AI-generated false alarms under crisis conditions. Meanwhile, the United States and Russia both continued maintaining launch-on-warning capabilities. Despite decades of arms control negotiations, neither country had been willing to abandon the ability to launch nuclear weapons quickly in response to warning of attack. The same time pressures that had made the 1979-1980 false alarms dangerous still existed. Former Secretary of Defense William Perry, now in his 90s, continued advocating for elimination of launch-on-warning procedures. In 2023 interview, he stated, "I have spent 40 years warning about the dangers of accidental nuclear war. The close calls of the Cold War should have taught us that quick launch procedures are incompatible with nuclear safety. But we continue maintaining systems designed for rapid response, which means we continue being vulnerable to false alarms, technical failures, cyber attacks, and human errors. At some point, our luck will run out. After the 1979 to 1980 false alarms, some strategic thinkers proposed fundamental alternative to launch on warning, except that American land-based missiles might be destroyed in Soviet first strike and rely entirely on submarine-based missiles for retaliation. American ballistic missile submarines were essentially invulnerable to Soviet attack. They operated in vast ocean areas where Soviet forces couldn't track them. Even if Soviet Union destroyed every American city, every military base, every ICBM silo, the submarines would survive and could retaliate with enough nuclear weapons to destroy Soviet Union in return. This meant the United States didn't need launch on warning. American deterrent would remain credible even after absorbing Soviet first strike. There would be no need for rapid launch decisions based on early warning data. No vulnerability to false alarms, no time pressure measured in minutes. The proposal was called second strike only posture. It had been advocated by some strategists since the 1960s. The NORAD false alarms provided new arguments for adopting it. Dr. Paul Nitze, veteran nuclear strategist who had served multiple administrations, made the case in 1981 testimony to Congress. Land-based ICBMs exist primarily to force the Soviets to target them in first strike, which uses up Soviet warheads that would otherwise hit our cities. This is called damage limitation. But the cost is that we must maintain launch on warning procedures to preserve the ICBM's retaliatory value. This creates vulnerability to false alarms. We should eliminate this trade-off by abandoning land-based missiles and relying on submarines alone. The proposal had several advantages. It would eliminate the need for rapid launch decisions, reducing false alarm risks to near zero. It would remove the most vulnerable part of American nuclear forces, eliminating Soviet incentive for first strike. It would save money by phasing out expensive ICBM modernization programs. And it would strengthen deterrence by making American retaliation certain, rather than dependent on successfully launching during attack. But the proposal faced multiple obstacles. The Air Force strongly opposed eliminating ICBMs, which were Air Force mission. The defense industry opposed losing ICBM contracts. And nuclear strategists warned that abandoning launch on warning would signal weakness and undermine deterrence. The debate came down to competing conceptions of deterrence. Did deterrence require threatening rapid retaliation that could destroy Soviet nuclear forces before they launched? Or was it sufficient to threaten certain retaliation against Soviet society, even if Soviet nuclear forces survived? Launch on warning advocates argued that deterrence required keeping Soviet forces targeted. If Soviet Union believed it could destroy American ICBMs without facing counterforce retaliation, Soviet war planners might believe nuclear war was winnable. Second strike advocates argued that threatening Soviet society was sufficient deterrent. No rational leadership would accept destruction of their country, even if their military forces survived. Rapid launch capability added vulnerability to false alarms without strengthening deterrence. The Reagan administration chose to maintain ICBMs and launch on warning capabilities. The decision was based on military advice that second strike only posture would weaken deterrence and on political calculation that abandoning weapon systems would appear soft on defense. The alternative path was not taken, and with it, the vulnerabilities to false alarms were preserved. In subsequent decades, every administration re-examined nuclear posture and reached the same conclusion. ICBMs would be maintained and modernized. Launch on warning capabilities would be preserved. The risks of false alarms were acceptable costs of maintaining robust deterrent. Critics pointed out that this decision meant that accidents like the 1979 to 1980 false alarms would remain possible. The response was that improvements in technology and procedures had reduced those risks to acceptable levels. But acceptable levels was judgment call. How much risk of accidental nuclear war was acceptable? 1 incident per decade? 1 per century? The probability was unknowable because it depended on technical failures, human errors, and crisis conditions that couldn't be predicted. In 2022, physicist Stephen Starr calculated the accumulated risk of accidental nuclear war over time. His model suggested that if nuclear weapons remained on launch-on warning status indefinitely, the probability of eventual false alarm leading to accidental launch approached certainty as time extended across decades and centuries. Starr's conclusion: we are playing Russian roulette with civilization. The chamber we're pointing at our head is mostly empty. The probability of catastrophe on any given day is very low. But if we keep pulling the trigger day after day, year after year, eventually we will hit the loaded chamber. The question is not whether false alarm will cause accidental nuclear war, but when, unless we change the system. The alternative was available. Submarine-based deterrent made launch-on warning unnecessary. But choosing that alternative required accepting that some American nuclear forces might be destroyed before retaliation was launched. And political and military leadership consistently judged that accepting that vulnerability was worse than accepting the risk of false alarms. The trade-off had been made. The risks had been accepted. And the patterns that had nearly caused nuclear war in 1979 and 1980 remained embedded in nuclear strategy and command systems. The officers who managed nuclear forces during the Cold War are nearly all retired or deceased. The generation that experienced the 1979-1980 false alarms firsthand has mostly aged out of military service. The nuclear command positions are now filled by officers who were born after the Cold War ended. They operate more sophisticated systems with better safeguards, but they face the same fundamental challenge: maintaining nuclear forces ready to launch within minutes while preventing false alarms from triggering catastrophic mistakes. In 2023, journalists interviewed 3 young Air Force officers serving in nuclear command positions. Their perspectives revealed both continuity and change in how military professionals thought about their responsibilities. Captain Jennifer Rodriguez, Missile Combat Crew Commander at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, described her training. We spend months learning the technical procedures for launching ICBMs, how to authenticate launch orders, how to execute firing sequences. But we also study the false alarm incidents from 1979 and 1980. They drill into us that our most important responsibility might be deciding not to launch when something seems wrong with the alert. Rodriguez's training emphasized the importance of independent judgment even when it contradicted procedures. This represented evolution from Cold War training that had emphasized rapid execution of orders. The modern Air Force explicitly taught officers that questioning potentially erroneous alerts was part of their duty. Lieutenant Michael Chen, early warning analyst at Peterson Space Force Base, described working with AI-assisted threat assessment systems. The AI can process satellite data faster than humans and identify patterns we might miss. But we've been trained to be skeptical of AI assessments. The system might be 99% accurate, but that 1% could be false positive that leads to nuclear launch. So we cross-check everything manually, even though it slows down response time. Chen's approach reflected lessons learned from decades of false alarms. Technology was tool, not replacement for human judgment. The newest systems had capabilities the 1979 early warning computers couldn't match, but they also had failure modes that couldn't be fully predicted. Major David Patterson, Strategic Air Command Liaison Officer, described the psychological burden of nuclear duty. You're constantly aware that your decisions could end civilization. Not just kill people, but end human civilization. Every day I come to work wondering, will today be the day when false alarm occurs during crisis and I have to decide whether to recommend launch? That weight never goes away. You learn to function with it, but you never forget it's there. Patterson's reflection echoed what Cold War officers had described in their oral histories. The technology had changed, but the psychological burden remained constant across generations. The young officers were also aware that their careers might end if they made wrong judgment call during false alarm. If they hesitated to report genuine attack and enemy weapons destroyed American forces, they'd face court-martial. If they incorrectly reported false alarm as genuine attack and triggered unnecessary alert, they'd be punished. The only way to be vindicated was to be right, and being right often meant violating procedures. Captain Rodriguez summarized the paradox. They train us to follow procedures exactly, but they also tell us that officers in 1979 and 1980 prevented nuclear war by not following procedures when those procedures would have led to disaster. So, which is it? Do we follow the checklist or trust our judgment? The answer is it depends, and getting it wrong could end the world. That's what we live with. The Air Force had implemented some reforms based on Cold War lessons. Officers now had more authority to question alerts before escalating. Decision windows had been slightly lengthened to allow more verification. Multiple independent confirmations were required before highest alert levels were reached. But the fundamental structure remained. Nuclear forces maintained on alert status, capable of launching within minutes, vulnerable to false alarms that could trigger catastrophic responses if they occurred during crisis conditions. The next generation of nuclear officers inherited the system their predecessors had built. They operated with better technology and deeper understanding of false alarm risks. But they still faced the possibility that on some future day, their screens would show incoming attack, and they'd have minutes to determine whether civilization was about to end or whether it was another computer error. And if they chose wrong, there might not be time to correct the mistake. November 9th, 2024. 45 years to the day after the first NORAD false alarm. No commemorative ceremonies were held. No official statements were issued. The anniversary passed largely unnoticed, except by historians and the dwindling number of veterans who remembered living through those terrifying minutes. But the warning from those incidents remains as urgent as ever. Nuclear weapons still exist, thousands of them maintained on alert status, ready to launch within minutes. The command and control systems are more sophisticated than they were in 1979, but they remain vulnerable to technical failures, human errors, cyber attacks, and the chaos of crisis conditions. The risks that nearly caused accidental nuclear war 45 years ago have not been eliminated. They have been reduced, managed, and surrounded with better safeguards. But they persist because the fundamental structure of nuclear deterrence still requires forces ready to launch quickly in response to warning of attack. Every day that passes without nuclear weapons being used is a day when the systems worked as intended and luck held. But luck is not strategy, and systems that depend on luck eventually fail. The story of the 1979-1980 false alarms is not ancient history. It is warning about present danger. The patterns that nearly triggered nuclear war then, through the dismissal of technical warnings, institutional resistance to acknowledging systemic problems, and reliance on individual judgment to prevent catastrophe, still exist in nuclear command systems today. Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins tried to warn his superiors about vulnerabilities in early warning systems. He was dismissed as overcautious. The systems failed exactly as he had predicted. By the time he was vindicated, the failures had already occurred. Colonel Robert Basley and the other officers who recognized the November and June false alarms as erroneous made correct decisions under impossible time pressure. They prevented nuclear war by trusting their judgment over their procedures. But they did so without certainty, and the next officers facing similar decisions might not be as fortunate or as skeptical. The young officers managing nuclear forces today are better trained and better equipped than their predecessors. But they face the same fundamental challenge: maintaining forces ready for instant retaliation while preventing false alarms from triggering catastrophic mistakes. And the institutional cultures that resisted warnings in 1979 persist in military organizations today. Technical experts who identify potential vulnerabilities still face skepticism from operational commanders who trust proven systems. Comprehensive safety reviews are still delayed until failure forces recognition. Career incentives still favor confidence over caution. The alternative path, abandoning launch on warning and relying on survivable submarine-based deterrent, remains available. But it remains politically unacceptable for the same reasons it was rejected in 1981. Military culture values rapid response capability. Defense industry profits from land-based missile modernization. And strategic theorists worry that appearing vulnerable encourages adversaries. So the risks continue. The loaded chamber remains in the revolver. And every day we collectively pull the trigger and hope we survive another day without catastrophe. Former Secretary of Defense William Perry, now 96 years old, has spent the last 2 decades of his life trying to warn the world about nuclear dangers. In 2024 interview, he was asked why he continues this work despite making limited progress. Perry's response? Because the alternative is giving up. And if we give up, if we accept that accidental nuclear war is inevitable eventually, then it becomes truly inevitable. The only way to prevent it is to keep warning, keep pushing for change, keep reminding people that the systems we rely on for safety are not as safe as we believe. Maybe this generation won't listen. Maybe the next one will. But we can't stop trying. The lesson of the NORAD false alarms is not that nuclear command systems failed and were fixed. It is that complex systems fail in ways that can't be fully anticipated. And institutional cultures resist changing those systems until failure proves change is necessary. That pattern will continue. New technologies will introduce new vulnerabilities. New leaders will make the same mistakes previous generations made. And new warnings will be dismissed until new failures force recognition. Unless we choose differently. Unless we listen to the technical experts who warn about potential problems before those problems cause catastrophes. Unless we accept that confidence can be dangerous and caution can be wise. Unless we acknowledge that luck is not strategy and that systems depending on luck eventually fail. The world did not end in November 1979 or June 1980. Nuclear war did not start because of a training tape or a 46-cent computer chip. But it could have. The margins were measured in minutes, and the outcomes depended on individual judgment calls that could easily have gone differently. We survived those incidents. The question is whether we'll survive the next ones. Because there will be next ones. The systems are too complex, the time pressure is too extreme, the potential for error too great. False alarms will occur. The question is whether they'll occur during calm periods when they can be recognized and corrected, or during crises when they'll be believed and acted upon. 45 years after the NORAD false alarms, we remain one computer error, one human mistake, one crisis misunderstanding away from accidental nuclear war. That is the warning. It remains unheeded. And time continues passing while we hope our luck holds. If you lived through the Cold War, if you remember the constant fear of nuclear annihilation, this story should remind you that the danger never truly ended. The weapons remain, the risks persist, and the systems protecting us are less reliable than we want to believe. If you're too young to remember the Cold War, this story should teach you that nuclear weapons are not abstract historical artifacts. They are active threats requiring constant vigilance and luck that might not last forever. Share this story. Remember this history. Demand that leaders take nuclear risks seriously. Because the alternative is continuing to depend on luck and individual judgment to prevent catastrophe. And eventually, inevitably, that luck will run out. Subscribe to this channel to hear more forgotten stories from the Cold War. Like this video to help others learn about the nuclear dangers we've survived and the ones we still face. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you remember living under nuclear threat. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for understanding that the past is not safely behind us. The dangers that nearly destroyed us then are still with us now. The warning remains unheeded, the clock keeps ticking, and we continue hoping that when the next false alarm occurs, someone will make the right judgment call in time.